Alright, hey guys, welcome back to another video. So today I wanted to discuss a topic with all of you that's been on my mind for the past few weeks. And I'm sure the title of this video has grabbed your attention because it's blasphemous. How can I like Bubsy 3D? So I wanted to make this video because I really believe that this game gets such an unwarranted bashing on the internet that it just absolutely does not deserve. This is not going to be a review of the game. I'm not going to be flashing gameplay to go at what I'm saying. I just really want to talk about something that's really been bothering me. So Bubsy 3D. I actually picked this up recently at the Game On Expo. And the reason why I wanted to buy this game is because all these years I've sort of been brainwashed. And I also believe that everybody out there has been brainwashed to believe that Bubsy 3D is an unbelievably bad, unplayable game. It's always in the top lists of like worst games of all time, and some people call it the worst game of all time. Actually, if you Google search Bubsy 3D, the first suggested search that you should do comes up as Bubsy 3D, worst game of all time. So I've always avoided this game because I figured, well, so many people hate this game, nobody loves it, it has to be that bad. But then one night in Twitch, someone said that, there's this one person that, I don't know if this is true or not, but someone's apparently invested like 100 hours in the Bubsy 3D, finding all the ins and outs, and like they've dissected the game in and out. And I just found that so fascinating that someone would be out there that would really love the game. They apparently this person enjoyed it, and I said, you know what? Maybe Bubsy 3D isn't that bad. Maybe I want to give this game a chance. And you guys know me. If you've watched me over these last 8 years, you know that I like to give a lot of games a try. And I can usually find a redeeming quality in a game that might be mediocre or just not so great. And I wanted to try that with Bubsy 3D, so I made it a mission of mine to find a copy of this game at one of the conventions I went to. I found it, and I started to stream it on Twitch. Okay? So let me just say, right off, Bubsy 3D is a good game. I don't want you to misquote me. I don't want you to say that Pete loves Bubsy 3D. It's one of the most amazing platformers out there. It's, no, I'm not saying that. Bubsy 3D, after I completed the game, and yes, I finished Bubsy 3D, which is something I'm going to get to in a second, I feel that it is a good game. It's not an amazing game. It has its problems. Yes, it can be frustrating, but in the end, I had an enjoyable experience. So first, let me cover something before I get into the game itself. Back to the brainwashing idea. People are having this thought put into their minds automatically that Bubsy 3D is a bad game, okay? Because it's actually kind of upset me. Because I've never really watched reviews on Bubsy 3D. I've always just heard it's bad. But before I made this video, I made it a point, just so I know that I'm talking, not, out of my butt or something. Like, I want to have concrete things I can argue against. I watched a couple of reviews for Bubsy 3D on YouTube, all of which I had previously never watched before. One of which calls it an absolutely horrible game, but what really bugged me is, having beat the game, almost every review that you watch, almost, not all, almost every review that you watch will only play the first level or two of the game. And they never make it further. All they do is just bash the game for its poor controls, its bad voice acting, and blah, 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 blah. But they never get far in the game. Now, let me admit, when I first started Bubsy 3D, it was a hard game. Yes, it was kind of aggravating trying to get used to the controls. They're not ideal. They're tank controls in that, this game was made before analog, okay? There was no joysticks, there's nothing like that, and I'm going to get to the comparison of Mario 64, just hold on. So yes, the controls were tank-like. Think of it like almost like a Resident Evil, but more closely resembling a Tomb Raider game where you have to stop, turn your character, then move. It's sort of like this very rigid movement system. Is it hard at first? Yes. It's a little slippery when you're trying to move and run at the same time. But after a couple of levels, it really started to click. After you spend some time with the game, you don't just give up on it, or you don't just get, aggravated and try and rush through it. The controls really click. And after a while, I felt that the platforming and the movement in the game was not that bad. A lot of the jumping in this game it requires a lot of precision, just like a Tomb Raider game would. It might sound weird in a platformer sense, but you have to keep in mind this Bubsy 3D came out in a time, it was in development, where there really were no 3D platformers. When the developers were working on this game, Mike Berlin, the original designer of Bubsy that came back to work on Bubsy 3D, said in an interview that at the time of development for this game, he had never worked with any kind of 3D modeling. Like, he had no idea how to program a game in 3D. No game had existed prior to sort of have as a way to sort of model your game after. Now, keep in mind, this is in development at the same time as Mario 64, and a lot of people that are sort of maybe not in the know will say, oh, Bubsy 3D is just a ripoff of Mario 64. Keep in mind, this game was being made at the same time, and it was at a CES that Mike Berlin said that, they were showing off a beta, like an alpha sort of, well, not alpha, but beta version, not quite shippable version of Bubsy 3D at this CES Consumer Electronics Show. And they went over to Nintendo's booth and they were showing off a shippable version of Mario 64. And they went over there and they were like, wow, this looks amazing. And, we need to make Bubsy 3D more complete, more complex to try to compete with Mario 64, because it was very obvious to them that Mario 64 was going to be a benchmark, title for 3D platforming, which Bubsy 3D at the same time was trying to do, albeit different hardware, different software on a CD, without the analog control. But at that point, it was too late. Accolade rightfully was, trying to push this game out for release. You can't sit, if you're a publisher, you can't have your developers just endlessly working on this game when, you need to get it out there in order to compete in a market before it's too late, before other 3D platformers come out. It was supposed to come out around the same exact time as Mario 64, but it was actually delayed, I believe, a couple of months to sort of wait until the hype and excitement died down for Mario 64. Which, of course, at the time, I believe if someone had... Not a lot of people back then would own a PlayStation and an N64, so it's my belief that probably a lot of people that played Bubsy 3D when it first came out probably kind of enjoyed it, because it was the first foray of sorts into a 3D open world platform. Yes, there was Crash Bandicoot, but that's all on rails. Keep in mind, that probably was intentional at the time when Crash Bandicoot came out. It may have been for a stylistic approach, but my belief is that at the time, Naughty Dog as well probably didn't have the capabilities to make an open world 3D, fully 3D platformer such as Bubsy. But yes, it came out at the wrong time. Would Bubsy 3D be better, more well received if it had came out before Mario 64? My belief is yes, it probably would have. If it came out well after Mario 64, that's hard to say. Can you blame the game's failure and poor sales on, the success of Mario 64? It's not really, it's not something concrete that you can say, yes, it failed because of Mario 64. Anyway, getting back to the whole YouTube idea, kind of like brainwashing everybody to hate Bubsy. Every review of Bubsy was either just the first or second level, or I've noticed this one review did this where they would use a level select code, and me having beat the game, I knew what they were doing was they were just going from level to level. There are 18 levels. They would record about 30 seconds of the beginning of each level, and then pass their review off as though they had finished the game and still hated it. How do I know? Because I finished the game myself very recently. It took me about 13 to 15 hours or so, and I knew that they were just showing the beginnings of levels, and they keep on complaining about poor controls and this and that and the platforming, and I'm like, yeah, but if you had actually been playing the game up until this point, the levels get progressively more difficult. You would be more used to the platforming, and you wouldn't have these troubles in later levels, right? It kind of makes sense. Another thing is the telltale sign, okay, that you can tell that someone that says they don't like Bubsy 3D or they've done a review is if they complain about the constant talking and voice acting of Bubsy, which first of all, I want to refute and say that I actually really don't mind the voice actor, or actress in this case, I believe, for Bubsy. It's sort of comical, it's very cheesy, it's a little over the top, but I think it sort of adds personality to a character, whereas if you look at Mario 64, or if you look at like even Gex, for example, a lot of platformer mascots back then didn't have much personality beyond their persona, their look. And Bubsy was always ahead of that curve, even back on the Genesis with the original release, where Bubsy would have voice dialogue. What could possibly go wrong? Or, all these voiced lines that Bubsy always had, and he always had this repertoire of silly one-liners that they carried over to Bubsy 3D. Now here, getting back to my point, the first level, and a little bit of the second level, but especially the first level, Bubsy talks a lot. It's more of a tutorial stage. There's a lot of question marks that appear where if you run over them, Bubsy will kind of say, oh, this and that, like silly things like breaking fourth wall stuff like, oh, the programmers, it's nice of them to put all these tutorial question marks around here, silly stuff like that. And people just hark on this fact that Bubsy never shuts up and it's annoying, but if you play the game, you'll soon find out that by like the third level, Bubsy barely says anything. Yeah, if you encounter a new enemy or something like that, he might say one or two new things, but by the end of the game, Bubsy was quite silent, and I was actually kind of excited when I heard one of his new silly 90s one-liners. Okay, so let's get back to the point of if you plan on playing Bubsy 3D. So let's approach it this way. If you plan on playing Bubsy 3D, you need to have, you need to be patient. You can't be the type of person that gets mad at games, throws controllers, okay? I've never thrown a controller. I've never gotten that angry at a game. I've never kind of quite understood that mindset of getting so angry at a game that you would actually physically throw something. So I'm not that type of gamer. So maybe you need to be a bit more calm-minded, more patient, because the first level or two, or three, you're going to be struggling with the controls. Yes, they're difficult, but you will get used to them. Practice makes perfect. Actually, the jumping mechanic in this game, I believe, is one of the best jumping mechanics in 3D platformers. Why? Because when you jump, the camera angles down so that you can see where you're jumping. And then you can also control your jump mid-air, which back then was sort of, still relatively new, especially in the landscape of 3D platformers. The jumping in this is pretty good. There's a ledge grab. Okay, and if you need evidence or video of any of this, you can go on Twitch and watch my past broadcasts, and you can watch me play Bubsy 3D in its entirety. The number one tip I will give you, though, for those of you that are seriously considering playing this game, and it's something that would have saved me a lot of aggravation, and I probably would have been able to finish the game much faster. The first level has 3 extra lives. Okay, you can get an extra life after you collect 100 of these scattered around atoms that they have throughout every level, but don't worry about that, okay? If you want to make your life a lot easier playing through Bubsy 3D, especially in the later levels, after you get a grasp on the controls, or even after you just complete the first level, continually run the first level, collect the 3 extra lives, which are really easy to get right in the beginning of the level. Okay, do this maybe about a dozen or so times, and believe me, once you get the pathing down, you can beat the level in a minute and a half, no problem. And then you stockpile this huge stockpile of extra lives, and then you can go through the game without worry of getting a game over. So the biggest problem that I was running into is towards the mid-half, later end of the game. When you die and get a game over, it restarts you at 3 continues. And some of the levels, and some reviewers were saying the levels are so short, blah, blah, blah. No, some of the later levels are actually pretty long, let me tell you. They're quite expansive. There's a lot of different hidden areas and secrets. But I'm like losing, I keep jumping around because there's so many different things that I want to refute about Bubsy 3D. These extra lives when you die, having 3 continues at some of these later levels makes them very, very difficult to complete on 3 extra lives. So what you can do is if you ever start running low on lives and you're getting towards the end of the game, just go back to level 1, farm it a few times, get a stockpile of extra lives, and suddenly the game is more enjoyable to play because you don't have that constant fear of having to restart a level from scratch, which really helped me in the final few levels. Once I found out that you could do this, it made the final few levels of Bubsy, which would have otherwise been very, very difficult, actually kind of enjoyable to play. So the next thing that's on a lot of people's minds and they complain about are the graphics, okay? So yes, Bubsy 3D looks like it is still in an early, development phase in terms of its graphics. I'd say 90 to 95% of the game is untextured. A lot of things are blank polygonal shapes, but at the same time, I kind of like it. And I'm not just saying this to say, I'm not trying to pick at every little point of Bubsy 3D and say it's the most amazing game and, trying to just find reasons to say it's good. I actually genuinely like the style of graphics in Bubsy 3D. Why? Because there were no games like this. I've never played a platformer like Bubsy 3D that has this sort of unfinished look. Everything on the PlayStation was always textured and, it looked muddy. Whereas going back, not all games, I shouldn't say that, but Bubsy 3D has such a unique look because everything is flat shaded, super bright, the graphics are popping. It sort of reminds me of a Looney Tunes game, if it were to be a Looney Tunes game back in the day with cel-shaded graphics before cel-shaded graphics were a thing without the black lines. It's super stylized. Yeah, some things look, odd. You'll be running around a stage and suddenly a black mountain will just pop out of the background out of nowhere, or there's just these shapes in the background that just make absolutely no sense. But at the same time, it adds a unique personality to Bubsy 3D. You can also tell that a lot of love and care sort of went into the design of these levels, because I actually don't have it on me, it's somewhere else right now, but the developers went through the trouble of making a map that came with the game that had the first 3 levels of the game world fully mapped out with all the secrets and everything like that. Like, the framework for a good platformer was there. And this carries true later on in the game, because the levels, like I said, are quite expensive. There's a lot of hidden secrets. There's a lot of hidden rooms. Is it fleshed out, fully developed? Absolutely not. I mean, there are mechanics in the game that feel like they could have used more development time, such as this shooting mechanic where you can run into an atom by holding the square button, you grab onto it, and you can kind of rotate around and shoot it at enemies. That feels a bit unfinished, but graphically, I like it. People also complain about the checkerboard floors, which you have to keep in mind. If they were being rushed, sure, they probably wanted to put in some texturing on the floors, but if you have a game that is all polygons, you need a way to judge depth, distance, and the best way to do that, now I'm not a game developer or programmer, but I would imagine the best way to do that is that a checkerboard pattern on the floor, because then that helps better judge distance. You know, the thing that comes to mind for me is when I watch people that were playing like a Street Fighter 4 game competitively, a lot of times they'll play in that fighting arena where it's like that checkerboard grid, because that helps you judge distance around you. So that's sort of my reasoning behind that. So yes, graphically the game will not be for everybody, and a lot of times people boot the game up and just hark on how bad it looks. But if you can actually look past the graphics, or actually like them like me, you might find a quite unique experience. Now let's get to the music. Another thing that just, oh my god, it just bugged the hell out of me. I don't remember what review it was, and I'm not calling people off their reviews, but I'm just kind of pointing out, you know, how people are, I feel like people are afraid to say that they like Bubsy 3D, because it's so widely accepted that Bubsy 3D is the worst game of all time. I feel like people are scared to put out a video like this that say the opposite, that Bubsy 3D is a somewhat pretty good game. Like, it's as though as if you put a video out there, if you can just say, oh, I like Bubsy 3D, you're gonna get like the strangest looks, and it's like, I don't trust you anymore. Like, how can you like Bubsy 3D? Anyway, the music. One review said that the music repeats itself and it's like one track that's just recycled with a little bit of different sound samples throughout the whole game. Absolutely not. Once again, an example of someone that barely played the game. And had they given it more of a chance, or not been afraid to say, you know, hey, maybe this game isn't the worst game of all time. Or, you know, hey, maybe I want to make content that isn't, you know, made for the sole fact of making people laugh to get entertainment value out of it, because, oh, Bubsy 3D is like the game to do a video on, you know, for that silly entertainment value. You know, I watched this one review, and I know I'm like jumping all over the place, but there's so much I need to say about Bubsy 3D. This one review, the guy physically takes a Bubsy 3D disc and breaks it with a hammer. Like, I mean, I'm sure that's a play on Angry Video Game Nerd, because I know that's been a stick of his for, you know, many, many years. He likes to, you know, destroy games in funny ways, but it's like, really? I mean, do people really defaming a game like that, you know, that people worked quite passionately on, I'm sure, because it you know, they were reviving. Don't forget, Bubsy started as its own game on the Genesis. The Accolade decided to have someone else develop the sequel. Now, I haven't played the sequel of Bubsy. And imagine how that makes the original creator and some of the people that originally worked on Bubsy, how does that make them feel? Probably not that great that their creation has been handed off to another development team. When that game failed, the original creator was brought back to work on the game, and I'm not sure how many members of the original team, probably maybe none, I'm not sure, had been brought back on to revive this series. And, you know, I'm sure a lot of their heart and soul went into trying to make the game as good as they could with the programming skills and the knowledge that they had of this newly forthcoming 3D platforming genre. Anyway, the music. Back to the music. Sorry about that. The game actually, as it goes on, levels have their own unique sounds, like their own unique tracks. And towards the end of the game, some of the tracks were super impressive. I'd actually go as far as to say that I would listen to some of the music from Bubsy 3D separately outside of the game, because some later levels were like really atmospheric and just creepy in some sort of sense. So I'm sure there's things I'm forgetting to mention about Bubsy 3D, and like I said, I played the game to completion on Twitch, so you can watch that if you want, and I'm sure this video is going on way too long, so thank you if you've stuck with me for this long. But what I want to say in the end is that don't believe everything that you see online, especially if it's a video that is done in an entertainment style where the channel's focus is on providing funny reviews, being overly critical of a game like Bubsy 3D. I mean, a lot of the stuff that's said is unwarranted, and if the person had spent more time on the game, they may still hate it. What are you going to do? You can't change some people's opinions. But had they given it the proper chance, like I had, and I feel like streaming on Twitch supplied me with that extra fuel to power through the game and see it through to its completion, because I set that goal for myself that I wanted to finish the game, to be able to say for myself, what are the good things about Bubsy? What are the bad things? Is this the worst game of all time? Is it a bad game? In the end, I can say no. In my personal opinion, being a fan of platformers and collectathon platformers, classic platformers like this, I believe, have died out, only soon to be revived, hopefully, by Yooka-Laylee. Bubsy 3D is a good game that the high points of it may not be the high points for others. The low points of it are probably the low points for a lot of people. But if you give it a chance, you may come to like it. And let this be a lesson to those of you out there. Just because the majority of people say a game is bad or not good or one of the worst games of all time, don't take their word for it. Play it yourself and find out for yourself if it is indeed the worst game of all time. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video.